It began with an innocent question in a quiet classroom, one that shattered the illusion of royal control. Princess Charlotte, eyes wide with confusion, asked her teacher, "Why can't Mummy be queen now?" A moment meant to stay private exploded into a global firestorm when the teacher couldn't stay silent. And now, the monarchy is bracing for impact. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The teacher hesitated at first. Bound by discretion, duty, and the crushing weight of what it meant to interact with royalty, she had kept silent for weeks. But the look on Charlotte's face, so full of quiet pain, not tantrum or entitlement, haunted her. She looked sad more than angry, the teacher would later say. The words weren't spoken with defiance, but with confusion. Not rebellion, but heartbreak. In a palace obsessed with image and tradition, it was this one fragile sentence from a child that tore open the walls. The moment leaked in whispers, then in headlines. At first, it was denied, then reframed, then downplayed. But it was too late. The teacher's confession struck a chord with the public like lightning through old wood. People weren't just reacting to what Charlotte had asked, they were reacting to the fact that she had felt the need to ask at all. The question hit nerves that had been carefully buried for decades. Why wasn't Catherine queen? Why was the crown still held at arm's length from the woman the world already saw as the monarchy's heart? Inside palace walls, panic spread quickly. The school was put under a hush order. The teacher, though praised publicly, was allegedly pressured privately to retract her words. Statements were drafted, meetings held, protocols rewritten overnight. But none of it worked. The dam had broken. Social media flooded with hashtags, think pieces, emotional outpourings. Catherine's name trended for days, not because of a royal tour or fashion choice, but because her daughter had asked the one question no one in the royal family dared say aloud. And while royal aides tried to wrap it in spin, those closest to the situation knew better. This wasn't a moment that could be erased. This wasn't a soundbite. It was a child's cry from within the castle. A cry that exposed not only emotional tension at home, but a generational reckoning inside the institution itself. But what Charlotte asked was more than a child's question. It was an echo of a deeper, dangerous truth whispered in palace corridors. For years, Catherine played the role of supportive wife and graceful consort. But behind the serene smiles was a woman many believed was already a queen in everything but title. Charlotte's question ripped open a wound long ignored, and the nation began to ask the same. Almost overnight, public sentiment shifted from admiration to advocacy. Polls lit up with numbers that shook Buckingham to its core. Over 80% of respondents voiced that they believed Catherine should already bear the crown. Not just as queen consort, but in full sovereign spirit. It wasn't just affection anymore. It was demand. Inside the palace, the whispers grew louder. Royal insiders began to admit what had once been said only in private. Charles, they said, had always admired Catherine's elegance, but had also feared her rising influence. She made him feel old, one former aide reportedly confided. Not because of her youth, but because of her relevance. Her composure, her natural rapport with the public, her unforced diplomacy, it all cast a quiet shadow over the monarchy's traditional front. She didn't challenge the institution. She redefined it, without trying. Moments that had once passed without fanfare were now being unearthed with new meaning. The times she received louder cheers than Charles at public events. The occasions when her diplomatic tact softened hostile interviews. The charities that flourished under her attention. In hindsight, it all painted a picture of a woman who had been leading from behind the curtain. And yet, with the spotlight now glaring after Charlotte's heartbreaking curiosity, that curtain was burning away. But not everyone welcomed the shift. William, once comfortable in the balance of their dynamic, was now faced with a truth he hadn't anticipated. His wife was becoming the crown's emotional center. And that spotlight came with a cost. Paparazzi doubled their surveillance. Commentators dissected her every expression. The same system that had once adored her now threatened to consume her. And yet, she never flinched. Catherine remained silent, composed, moving through the chaos with a dignity that only fanned the flames of her public support. There were whispers, just whispers, of plans once drawn up behind closed doors. Secret conversations that suggested Charles had once considered elevating Catherine's status officially, giving her a title that would make her the visible face of the crown during periods of transition. But those plans, if they ever truly existed, had been buried, suppressed. And now, the people were digging. What they were beginning to unearth wasn't just admiration, it was a rebellion, polished in pearls and silence. But Catherine's strength was only part of the story. What came next revealed the cracks beneath the crown. He waited a lifetime for the throne, but just months into his reign, King Charles found himself eclipsed by a daughter-in-law with more approval than he ever dreamed of. And according to sources close to the palace, that wasn't just uncomfortable, it was threatening. For a man shaped by decades of waiting, of watching others take center stage, this was supposed to be his era, his moment. And yet, barely had the crown settled on his head when the public began whispering a different name, Catherine. Not out of rebellion, but out of admiration. Her composure, her grace, her ability to connect without fanfare. These weren't just qualities, they were eclipses, and Charles felt them in his shadow every day. Inside the palace, aides remember a shift. Meetings once focused on statecraft turned toward media strategy. A new phrase echoed through corridors: rebalance the spotlight. Behind closed doors, Charles reportedly grew impatient with coverage that leaned toward Catherine, often bypassing him entirely. One senior aide leaked a chilling quote, "Am I the king or a placeholder?" It was more than frustration. It was fear, not of losing power, but of losing relevance, of becoming the footnote in someone else's story, of watching the world crown a queen in spirit while he remained a monarch in title. And then came the turning point, Charlotte's question. A child's innocent inquiry became a political spark. Inside the palace, it was seen as more than curiosity, it was seen as a PR weapon. Some feared the narrative would shift even further in Catherine's favor, painting her not just as beloved, but as denied. And whispers began to rise, whispers of roles removed, appearances blocked, and one particularly hushed rumor that Catherine's participation in Charles's coronation had been trimmed deliberately, not out of protocol, out of insecurity. Fueling this dynamic was Camilla, loyal to Charles, yet always wary of Catherine's growing stature. Sources say she quietly pushed back, urging Charles to hold his ground, to remind the public who wore the crown. But it wasn't working. The more they pulled the spotlight back, the brighter Catherine's glow became. And Charles, once the patient heir, now sat at the center of a psychological storm. Resentful, anxious, cornered by adoration he couldn't command. The press didn't miss it. Headlines began to draw comparisons. Public opinion polls showed Catherine's favorability soaring above both king and queen. And still, she remained silent, never once fueling the fire, never once stepping out of line. But that silence? It said everything. It said strength. It said control. And to a man grappling with legacy, that silence was louder than applause. And while Charles wrestled with legacy, another player took center stage, one who would use silence like a sword. She had been the monarchy's most loyal guard dog. But behind palace walls, Princess Anne had seen too much, stayed silent too long. And when she heard what Charlotte had asked, she did what no one expected. She spoke. For decades, Anne had been the fortress, disciplined, unwavering, unshakable. The one who walked behind the crown but carried its weight with quiet strength. She didn't chase headlines, she protected them. But even iron has a breaking point, and when whispers of Charlotte's question reached her, something inside Anne shifted, not out of rage, but heartbreak. She had lived her life defending an institution she now feared was turning on itself. That day she called for Catherine. No press, no staff, just two women in a locked room. What was said between them hasn't been officially confirmed, but one aide, speaking off record, recalled Anne's trembling voice. This isn't about titles, it's about survival. Anne knew the palace, knew how truth was managed, buried, and rewritten. She had seen it happen before, with Diana, with Margaret, even with herself. But this time, it wasn't about personal pain, it was generational. It was about a little girl asking why the mother she admired wasn't allowed to lead. And Anne couldn't ignore it. Sources say she made it clear to the inner circle she would not attend the scheduled engagement with Camilla the following week. No excuses. No explanations. Just silence. That silence roared through the tabloids, triggering a media frenzy that tried to mask discomfort with polite speculation. But those closest to the throne knew what it meant. A fracture. A message. A reckoning. What made it all the more powerful was Anne's subtlety. She didn't grandstand. She didn't issue statements. She let her actions speak. And they did. With precision. In a quiet speech days later at a rural charity event, she broke script. Just a few words added, carefully and deliberately. The future rests on the shoulders of those unafraid to listen. It wasn't lost on anyone. The phrase went viral, dissected by analysts and royal watchers alike. Was it about Catherine? About Charlotte? Or about the silence Anne had broken at last? But the most damning shift was behind closed doors. For the first time in years, palace aides noted tension between Anne and Charles. Old wounds reopened. Resentments once suppressed rising like smoke. Anne, who had once defended her brother even when it cost her privately, now stood apart from him. Not in rebellion, but in truth. And in that truth, she seemed freer than ever. But while Anne whispered warnings, someone else was collecting secrets. Secrets hidden in royal archives for decades. Buried in the labyrinth of royal documentation was a clause forgotten, or hidden by design. Diana's legal team had planted a seed in her post-divorce will. And now, Charlotte's question made it bloom. The timing wasn't coincidental. As murmurs of that classroom moment rippled into something deeper, a curious legal researcher working on a royal biographical archive stumbled upon a line buried in dusty pages, a line few had ever read, and even fewer had understood. Diana, always a step ahead of the monarchy's mechanisms, had added an amendment. A personal note, attached but never publicly disclosed, that read, "The next Princess of Wales must never be silenced. Her voice will carry mine." Just 14 words. But they struck like thunder. Within hours of the leak, legal experts were called in. What did it mean? Could it hold any authority? Was it symbolic, or something more sinister? The debate was immediate and fiery. Constitutional scholars combed through decades of posthumous royal filings, only to discover that Diana's note had never been struck from the record. Legally murky, yes. Politically radioactive, absolutely. The document itself wasn't leaked by the palace, but by someone outside. And that someone, sources now suggest, may have ties to allies of Meghan Markle. A new twist to an already spiraling narrative. Meghan's camp began reposting snippets of the clause across anonymous social accounts. Messages like she warned them and the legacy speaks trended globally. Suddenly, this wasn't just about Catherine. It was about Diana. It was about silenced women in the royal machine. Caught flat-footed, royal legal counsel scrambled. Internal memos were leaked, showing confusion, panic, and an urgent push to locate every copy of the document in circulation. But it was too late. The damage, or the awakening, was already unfolding in public. Talk shows, op-eds, digital panels, all asking the same question. Did King Charles know about the clause? And if he did, why was it never honored? More hauntingly, had he spent years actively working to suppress the very wish his former wife had etched into her legacy? Catherine remained publicly silent, but those close to her hinted she was shaken. Not by the power of the clause, but by the vindication it brought. Everything she had endured, every headline, every backroom slight, now echoed with a haunting new weight. She wasn't imagining it. She was repeating history. And the people were watching. Inside the palace, alliances cracked. William, blindsided yet again, reportedly demanded a private legal briefing. Charles, meanwhile, was said to have retreated from all public comment, allegedly asking aides whether the clause was legally binding or emotionally inescapable, because that's what it had become. An echo from the past reshaping the present. And as history whispered its own justice, a modern queen's voice began to thunder across the kingdom. She didn't release a statement, she didn't hold a press conference. But in a single, calculated public appearance, Catherine said more than any speech ever could. The world took notice, and the palace flinched. Stepping out into the public eye after days of media frenzy, speculation, and royal silence, Catherine didn't need words. She chose symbolism. Draped around her neck was a piece the world hadn't seen in years, Princess Diana's sapphire choker. A bold, unmistakable signal. This wasn't just fashion. This was a message. A lineage reclaimed. A legacy worn like armor. Immediately, social media erupted. Within minutes, #Catherine deserves the crown trended across platforms. The press didn't just report it, they dissected it. Every movement, every glance. Her posture, strong. Her eyes, unshaken. One body language expert dubbed it a masterclass in regal resistance. But the real tremor came when she stood beside William. The tension between them wasn't performative, it was palpable. He looked rattled, she, composed. He glanced toward her for reassurance. She never broke her gaze with the crowd. It was the first time the future king looked like the one seeking approval. Behind the scenes, palace aides were scrambling. They hadn't anticipated this. Catherine had always played the long game, the loyal consort. But now she was stepping into a different light. And it wasn't one the monarchy had orchestrated. She wasn't challenging the throne, she was commanding the room. Quietly. Powerfully. And without permission. Royal watchers began comparing the moment to another era. The early days of Queen Elizabeth II. The way she bore the weight of a nation without flinching. The way her silence spoke louder than any man in uniform. Suddenly, Catherine wasn't just the Princess of Wales. She was being spoken of as a queen in waiting. Not in title, but in presence. And for the first time, commentators stopped wondering if she would one day be queen, and began asking how soon. But beyond the headlines and hashtags, there was a softer, almost invisible thread that pulled at public heartstrings. Paparazzi caught a fleeting, unscripted moment. Charlotte, standing beside her mother, beaming. A smile unguarded and genuine. The same child who'd cracked the illusion with a single question was now, finally, at ease. For viewers around the world, it felt like a resolution, a moment of healing. But for those inside the palace, it marked something far more dangerous. A turning tide. Because Catherine's silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Her calm wasn't peace. It was positioning. And the crown, already shaken, was about to be hit where it hurt the most. Not with scandal, not with rebellion, but with betrayal. The kind no one saw coming. The kind that doesn't just break trust, it rewrites destiny. But Catherine's composure wasn't the end. It was the calm before a betrayal no one saw coming. They were supposed to protect the institution. Instead, one royal aide flipped the script, leaking a series of internal memos revealing what the palace planned to do about Charlotte's question, and her mother. It was never meant to see the light of day. The strategy meetings, the curated talking points, the carefully worded directives meant to keep the public calm and the press distracted. But what the world saw instead was a machine moving swiftly to neutralize not scandal, but innocence. One document, dated just days after Charlotte's question made headlines, laid it bare, reframe as childhood confusion. Emphasize stability. Avoid addressing succession. Not guidance. A command. The aide, whose identity remains undisclosed, said they'd endured years of silent compliance. But something about this moment, this child, broke them. In a shocking admission to a journalist, they described the atmosphere as emotionally toxic and morally compromised. The final straw? A private recording. In it, Camilla's voice was unmistakable, dismissing Charlotte's question with a chilling phrase, "It's a brat's tantrum. She'll forget." But the world didn't forget. The moment the audio leaked, sympathy for Catherine turned into fire. Suddenly, this wasn't about optics, it was about a child's dignity, and a mother under siege. Public backlash erupted like a storm. Social media, already ablaze, now exploded with fury. Hashtags turned into demands. Within 24 hours, a petition to change the order of succession gathered over 500,000 signatures. Another petition, even more radical, demanded Camilla be stripped of all ceremonial duties. Analysts warned the monarchy hadn't seen this level of public revolt since the days following Diana's death. And yet, the palace held its line. Cold, calculated, unbending. But the leak had cracked something deeper. Trust. Senior royals were caught scrambling. Talking points drafted for Prince William and Princess Anne surfaced, urging them to speak calmly but firmly and reassure the public of the crown's future. But by then, the damage was irreversible. The public saw not reassurance, but repression. Every effort to control the narrative only deepened suspicion. For every step the monarchy took to restore control, the people stepped further into defiance. This wasn't a constitutional crisis, it was a moral one. And at the center of it all was Charlotte. Her name, her question, her face, now symbols not of scandal, but of resistance. What began as one child's confusion had become a nation's reckoning. Not even the crown could contain what had been set in motion. Because when the institution tries to silence its youngest, the world doesn't close its ears. It listens harder. And it was listening now, with fury and focus. As the walls of secrecy collapsed, one final confrontation was brewing, a reckoning decades in the making. Caught between duty to the throne and love for his daughter, Prince William reached a breaking point. His silence had once protected the monarchy. But now, it threatened to tear his family apart. For weeks he had watched the whirlwind build, Charlotte's question turned battleground, Catherine's name dragged into palace politics, and public trust corroding by the hour. But behind closed doors, William wasn't the composed heir the cameras knew. According to multiple insiders, he was fraying. Aides described a man worn thin by loyalty, responsibility, and the unbearable weight of choosing between the institution that raised him and the family that gave him purpose. Crisis talks were held in private. No press briefings, no official statements. Just William and Catherine behind thick palace walls, grappling with what it meant to be a future king and a present father. One source, close to the royal household, leaked a recording said to capture William in a moment of unfiltered despair. "I'm tired of choosing between them," he reportedly said, voice low, resigned. This shouldn't be the cost of love. The leak, unconfirmed but widely circulated, hit the public like a lightning bolt. For the first time, it seemed William was no longer standing on the sidelines. He was confronting the throne itself. And then came the visit. Late at night, unannounced, William was seen entering Clarence House through the staff entrance. No photographers, no official cars, no statement from the palace. What passed between father and son remains unknown. But the fallout was immediate. William's absence from a high-level royal engagement the following day made headlines. Rumors swirled. Had he refused to represent a monarchy that refused to protect his wife and children? Had the future king, even briefly, stepped back? Inside Kensington Palace, the emotional toll was visible. One witness claimed Charlotte was heard asking a nanny, "Is Daddy mad at Mummy?" The question pierced through the media circus, revealing the deeply human fractures beneath the gilded surface. This was no longer about duty. It was about the cost of silence. The cost of shielding an image while your own child asked why their mother wasn't seen as enough. Public opinion shifted dramatically. Social media, already ablaze, exploded with support. Not just for Catherine, but for William. Hashtags praising his stand surged. News outlets around the world reframed the narrative. Not a scandal, but a reckoning. The people weren't demanding royal obedience. They were begging for royal courage. And slowly, a new image of William began to form. No longer just the heir apparent, but a man forced to navigate the impossible. Trapped between tradition and truth. Torn between the throne and his daughter's voice. In every sense, the crown was no longer just a symbol. It was a burden. And William was carrying its full weight, one anguished decision at a time. And just when it seemed nothing more could unravel, an unexpected voice broke through the chaos. A voice that had been quiet since the beginning. He had walked away from it all. Titles, duty, expectations. But when Harry heard what his niece had asked, he flew back. Not for headlines. Not for conflict. For truth. And what he said behind palace gates may have changed everything. The jet touched down under the cover of darkness, but the ripples it sent through the monarchy were immediate. There was no official schedule, no red carpets or photographers, just a prince returning not to reclaim a title, but to protect something more sacred, his family. According to those closest to the situation, Harry didn't hesitate. The moment he learned about Charlotte's question, he booked the flight. Alone. Meghan remained in California, holding the silence but not out of distance. She was preparing something of her own. Inside the palace, shock turned to unease. Harry wasn't expected, and more importantly, wasn't accounted for in the tightly controlled narrative unraveling day by day. But it wasn't Charles or Camilla he asked to see first. It was Catherine and Charlotte. The meeting, held privately behind Kensington walls, has been described as raw, emotional, and unforgettable. Sources say Charlotte ran into her uncle's arms, confused but smiling. Finally, a familiar face who didn't speak in codes or caution. What Harry told her was simple, but searing. "Your mummy already is," he whispered when she asked again about the crown. "To us, to the world that sees clearly. She's already our queen." The public never saw the moment, but they felt its weight. Within hours, the tabloids were calling it the Sussex reconciliation, though insiders insisted there was nothing calculated about it. Just family, fractured, but still reaching. That same evening, Meghan quietly reposted a quote once spoken by Diana in a long-forgotten interview. "Being a queen in people's hearts means more than any title they can give." It was subtle, but the message was deafening. Suddenly, the world wasn't just focused on Charlotte's question. They were asking one of their own: had the royals been fighting the wrong war? And then, in the clearest sign that the tide had turned, Charles agreed to a meeting, off record. No staff, no press, just family. A conversation decades overdue. What was said behind that final closed door remains the subject of endless speculation. But one aide reported seeing something no one had expected: Charles, weary and silent, placing his hand on Catherine's shoulder before Harry left the room. No words, just a gesture, and maybe, just maybe, a beginning. The headlines shifted overnight. Not from scandal to celebration, but from silence to awakening. What started as one child's question had cracked the palace walls. The institution hadn't collapsed, but it had been changed. Forever. Because in the end, this wasn't about thrones or crowns. It was about truth. A truth no longer whispered behind velvet curtains, but spoken aloud by a girl too young to know fear, and answered by a family too tired to lie. And so, from one question came a revolution. But the story of this future queen, born not of blood, but of courage, was only just beginning. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.